The champagne glass trembled in Daniel Carter's hand as his brother's voice cut through the marble ballroom like a blade. You dare humiliate me in front of my guests. The sound of flesh meeting flesh, Victor's palm against Elise's shoulder, echoed off the crystal chandeliers. She hit the floor hard, her hospital bills scattering like fallen leaves across the polished marble. Daniel's breath caught. The woman who'd braided his hair as a child now knelt before 200 of the city's most powerful people. And they were laughing. If you love emotional, unforgettable stories that stay with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got so many more coming your way. But let me take you back to where this all began, 6 hours earlier, when the Carter Foundation Gala was still just another night of empty smiles and hollow promises. The Grand Meridian Hotel pulsed with orchestrated perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across walls draped in midnight blue silk. The city's elite moved through the ballroom like chess pieces, calculated, positioned, performing their roles in a game where reputation was currency and charity was just another tax write-off. Victor Carter stood at the center of it all, his charcoal tuxedo crisp as his smile was cold. At 45, he commanded the Carter Foundation with the same iron grip he'd once used to strangle toys in their childhood bedroom. His salt and pepper hair was swept back with military precision, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing. Every handshake, every whispered conversation, every flash from the society photographers. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor's voice boomed through the microphone, silencing 300 conversations at once. Tonight, we celebrate not just giving, but taking responsibility for our community's future. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Diamond earrings caught the light as heads nodded in approval. The Foundation's annual gala was the social event of the season, where checkbooks opened as readily as designer clutches. But Daniel Carter wasn't watching his brother command the stage. At 38, he stood in Victor's shadow, literally and figuratively, scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read danger in the tilt of an eyebrow or the pause between words. His navy tuxedo fit well, but he wore it like armor. His dark hair was softer than Victor's, falling across his forehead in waves their mother had once called artistic. His brown eyes, warmer than his brother's Arctic stare, caught the light differently, as if they were looking for something beyond the surface glitter. My brother Daniel has been instrumental, Victor continued, gesturing toward the shadows where Daniel stood. He handles our operational details. The crowd turned briefly toward Daniel, offering those thin smiles reserved for the powerful's less powerful siblings. He nodded, said nothing, returned their gazes to Victor. It was a dance they performed 1,000 times, Victor leading, Daniel following, both of them pretending it was a choice. Daniel's fingers found the small scar on his left wrist, a nervous habit from childhood. The raised skin was barely visible now, but he could still feel where Victor's toy soldiers had left their mark 30 years ago. Some wounds never quite heal, they just learn to hide better. The ballroom doors whispered open near the service entrance. A figure in a black uniform slipped through, hesitant, out of place among the evening gowns and pressed suits. Elise Thompson moved like someone trying to become invisible, her cleaning uniform marking her as clearly as a neon sign in this sea of designer fabric. At 28, Elise carried herself with a dignity that work uniforms couldn't diminish. Her dark skin glowed under the chandelier light, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the strong line of her jaw, her mother's jaw, though Daniel was the only one in this room who would remember that. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like a shield, its edges worn from anxious handling. The music, a string quartet playing something appropriately uplifting, began to falter as conversations died. Eyes turned. Whispers started. Is that? Staff isn't supposed to. Security should really. But Elise moved forward anyway, her footsteps soft on marble that probably cost more per square foot than she made in a month. Her eyes found Victor on the stage, and something in her face hardened. Determination, maybe. Or desperation. Sometimes they look exactly the same. Victor's speech stumbled to a halt. His pale eyes locked onto Elise, and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Memory. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold fury Daniel knew better than anyone. Please. Elise's voice was quiet but clear, trained by years of speaking to people who'd rather not hear her. "Mr. Carter, I just need a moment. You promised me." "Promised you." Victor's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. He stepped down from the small stage, moving toward her with predatory grace. "I don't make promises to the help." The crowd parted before him like water. 300 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when unstoppable force met immovable need. Daniel felt his chest tighten. The scar on his wrist began to burn. Elise opened the folder with trembling fingers, revealing hospital bills, insurance forms, and a photograph, a small boy with her eyes and smile, lying in a bed too big for his 6-year-old frame. "My son, Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He needs surgery, and you said the foundation would help families in crisis." "You said." "I said no such thing." Victor's voice was ice. "And I certainly didn't say it to you." But Daniel remembered. 3 months ago, in Victor's office, reviewing grant applications. Elise had cleaned that office every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years, invisible to Victor but not to Daniel. She'd been there when Victor, performing for a visiting board member, had made sweeping statements about helping all our community's children. She'd heard him say that the Carter Foundation's door was always open to families in need. Daniel had seen the hope light up in her eyes. He'd wanted to warn her then. Victor's public promises were like soap bubbles, beautiful and empty, designed to burst the moment someone tried to hold them. But he'd said nothing. He always said nothing. Now, watching his brother circle Elise like a shark scenting blood, Daniel felt the familiar weight of his own cowardice. "You must be confused," Victor continued, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. "Perhaps you've mistaken me for someone who cares about your personal problems." Cruel laughter rippled through sections of the crowd. Not everyone. Some faces showed discomfort, uncertainty. But enough. Enough to make Elise's shoulders straighten with defiance instead of fold with shame. "I'm not confused," she said quietly. "I remember everything you said. Every word." Victor's face darkened. In the corporate world, he was accustomed to people backing down, apologizing, disappearing when confronted with his displeasure. Elise's refusal to shrink made him dangerous. "Then you remember wrong." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried. "And you clearly don't understand your place." He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Close enough that the crowd could see the size difference, the power imbalance, the deliberate intimidation. "Your place," Victor repeated, "is on your knees, scrubbing my floors. Not here, embarrassing yourself in front of your betters." The words hit like physical blows. Elise's grip on the folder tightened, her knuckles pale against dark skin. But she didn't step back. "My place," she said, her voice steady as stone, "is wherever my child needs me to be." That's when Victor struck. Not with his fist. He was too smart for that, too aware of the cameras and witnesses. Instead, he reached out with calculated cruelty and shoved her shoulder, just hard enough to send her stumbling backward on heels not made for balance. Elise hit the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. The folder flew from her hands, hospital bills scattering like confetti. The photograph of Marcus skittered across the polished stone, coming to rest near the feet of a woman in a $10,000 gown who stepped back as if the image might stain her shoes. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some turned away. Others raised phones, already composing social media posts about the drama at the Carter Gala. A few, very few, moved forward as if to help, but stopped when Victor's gaze swept the room. "Look at you," Victor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "On the floor where you belong." More laughter now. Not from everyone, but from enough. The kind of people who found entertainment in others' humiliation, who confused cruelty with cleverness. Elise gathered herself slowly, pushing up from the marble with dignity intact despite everything. She reached for her son's photograph, her movements careful and precise. But her eyes burned with something that made several observers step back. That's when it hit Daniel like a freight train. The memory crashed over him with stunning clarity. Summer afternoon sunlight streaming through the garden windows of the Carter estate. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with knobby knees and too big clothes. Victor was 10, already showing the mean streak that would define him. And there, between them, was a girl with bright eyes and quick laughter, Rose's daughter, visiting while her mother worked. Elise. She'd been 7 then, all braids and boundless energy. While Victor tried to impress her with grand gestures, elaborate sandcastles, expensive toys he'd commandeer from Daniel, she'd been content to race Daniel to the apple tree or help Rosa braid friendship bracelets from garden twine. She doesn't even notice me, Victor had complained to Daniel one afternoon, watching Elise help Rosa hang laundry. I'm going to be rich and powerful someday, and she acts like I don't exist. Maybe she just likes different things, 8-year-old Daniel had suggested, earning himself a bruised shoulder that he'd hidden under long sleeves for a week. Rosa had noticed, of course. Rosa noticed everything. She'd pulled Daniel aside that evening, her weathered hands gentle on his face. Don't let him break your spirit, Danny, she'd whispered. You've got light in you. Don't let anyone put it out. But Rosa was gone now. Cancer, 5 years ago. Daniel had wanted to attend the funeral, but Victor had scheduled a board meeting that same afternoon. Business first, Victor had said. Always business first. Now Rosa's daughter knelt on marble floors while 300 people watched, and Daniel felt every choice he'd never made, every word he'd never spoken, every time he'd chosen silence over courage. His hands were shaking. The champagne glass trembled, crystal singing against crystal. Elise rose to her feet with the grace of someone who'd learned to find dignity in indignity. She gathered her scattered papers with methodical care, each movement deliberate. The photograph of Marcus, little Marcus who looked so much like she had at his age, she held last, cradling it against her chest. 21 years, she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying across the vast ballroom. 21 years my mother cleaned your house. Raised you boys when your own mother was too busy with charity committees to notice you were bleeding. The crowd stirred. This wasn't following script. Humiliated staff were supposed to slink away quietly, not speak truths that cut too close to bone. Victor's face flushed red. How dare you? She loved you both. Elise continued, her voice gaining strength. Even when you were cruel. Even when you broke Daniel's toys and blamed him for the damage. Even when you locked him in the basement and told your parents he was sulking. Daniel's breath caught. No one knew about the basement. No one except. Rosa knew. Elise said, as if reading his thoughts. She always knew. She'd find excuses to send you food. Daniel said you were growing and needed extra nutrition, but we both knew the truth. The ballroom had gone completely silent now. 300 people leaning forward, sensing drama that was about to spill over into something much more dangerous. Victor's composure was cracking. The careful mask he wore in public, charming, successful, slightly ruthless, but ultimately respectable, was slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. You don't know anything, he hissed, moving closer to Elise. You're just like your mother, delusional, presumptuous, thinking you matter to people like us. My mother mattered to Daniel, Elise said simply. She turned then, looking directly at him for the first time since she'd entered the ballroom. Her eyes found his across the crowd, across 30 years of silence and shame and swallowed words. She used to say you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever known, Elise said, her voice soft but carrying. She said you'd change the world someday, if you ever found the courage to try. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his conscience, the comfortable numbness that had protected him for decades, all of it crumbling under the weight of one woman's steady gaze. He thought about Marcus in that hospital bed, about Rosa's hands braiding his hair when Victor had pulled it too hard, about every time he'd chosen safety over righteousness, silence over truth. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, crystal shattering on marble like the sound of a life breaking open. Enough, Daniel said. The word came out rougher than he'd intended, rusty from disuse. But it carried across the ballroom with surprising force. Victor spun toward him, surprise flickering across his face. In 38 years, Daniel had never interrupted him, never contradicted him in public, never done anything but smile and nod and play the grateful younger brother. Daniel, Victor's voice held warning. This isn't your concern. But Daniel was already moving, stepping out of the shadows where he'd spent his entire life hiding. His legs felt unsteady, like he was learning to walk all over again. The crowd parted before him just as it had for Victor, but differently. Uncertainty rather than fear, curiosity rather than calculation. He knelt beside Elise, helping her gather the last of the scattered papers. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of working multiple jobs to pay for medical bills that kept growing faster than paychecks. But he could also see Rose's strength in the set of her jaw, Rose's kindness in the way she looked at him, without judgment, despite everything. "I remember you," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Summer afternoons. You taught me to make friendship bracelets." Her breath caught. Danny. The nickname hit him like a physical blow. No one had called him that in 20 years. Not since Rosa died and took with her the last person who'd seen him as something other than Victor's shadow. He stood, still holding some of her papers, and turned to face the crowd. 300 faces stared back at him. Board members, donors, socialites, reporters. People who'd known him his entire adult life, but had never really seen him. "You want to know who this woman is?" Daniel's voice was steady now, growing stronger with each word. "Her name is Elise Thompson. Her mother was Rosa Delgado, the woman who raised my brother and me when our own parents were too busy building their empire to notice we existed." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones appeared, recording everything. The story was already writing itself in real time. Social media posts composing themselves in minds trained to capture scandal. Victor stepped forward, his face dark with fury. "Daniel, you need to stop talking. Right now." But Daniel had spent 38 years stopping talking. 38 years swallowing words until they turned to poison in his gut. Tonight, they were coming up whether Victor liked it or not. "Rosa worked 16-hour days in our house," Daniel continued, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the ballroom. "She cooked our meals, cleaned our rooms, bandaged our cuts, and listened to our dreams. She was paid barely above minimum wage to be our mother in everything but name." The crowd was completely silent now, even the society photographers lowering their cameras to listen. "When Victor broke my arm pushing me down the stairs, Rosa is the one who drove me to the hospital. She told the doctors I fell off my bike because she knew our parents would find a way to blame me for making Victor angry." Gasps echoed through the room. Board members exchanged glances. This was going too far, revealing too much, threatening the careful image the Carter family had cultivated for decades. Victor lunged forward, grabbing Daniel's arm with bruising force. "Shut up," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're doing." Daniel looked down at his brother's hand on his arm, at the white knuckles and desperate grip. For the first time in his life, Victor looked afraid. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Daniel said quietly. Then, louder, "Rosa worked until the day she was diagnosed with cancer. She never asked for anything except fair wages and basic respect. When she died, she left behind a daughter who learned her mother's work ethic and her mother's heart." He gestured toward Elise, who was standing now, clutching her son's photograph. "Elise has cleaned Victor's office every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years. She's never missed a day, never complained, never asked for anything beyond her paycheck. Until 3 months ago, when her 6-year-old son was diagnosed with leukemia." The ballroom atmosphere shifted palpably. Charity galas were supposed to be about distant suffering, children in other countries, abstract causes that looked good on tax forms. This was immediate, personal, uncomfortable in its proximity. She heard Victor promise that the Carter Foundation would help any family in our community facing medical crisis. She believed him. She filled out the applications, provided all the documentation, followed every procedure. Do you know what answer she received? Daniel pulled a letter from his jacket pocket. Elise's rejection notice, the one she'd brought to him 2 weeks ago with tears in her eyes and hope dying in her voice. "The Carter Foundation does not provide assistance for personal medical expenses," he read aloud. "We suggest you contact other agencies better equipped to handle your specific needs." The letter was signed with Victor's signature stamp, approved without Victor ever seeing Elise's application. Daniel knew because he'd processed it himself, following policies designed to protect the Foundation's assets rather than serve its stated mission. Victor's face was pale now, his careful composure completely shattered. Around the room, board members were whispering among themselves. Phones were buzzing with incoming calls from lawyers and publicists, and somewhere in the crowd, a television reporter was already crafting tomorrow's headlines. "Every penny we've raised tonight," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger, "could save Marcus Thompson's life 3 times over. But instead, It'll go to administrative costs and board bonuses and tax-deductible write-offs that help rich people feel good about staying rich. The crowd was growing restless now. Some were nodding in agreement. Others were edging toward the exits, and a few were already calculating how to distance themselves from the Carter name before the scandal fully exploded. But Daniel wasn't done. 38 years of silence had created a reservoir of words that needed to be spoken. Rosa used to tell me that real power isn't about what you can take from people, he said, his eyes finding Elise's across the room. It's about what you choose to give, especially when no one's watching, especially when there's nothing in it for you. Victor made one last desperate attempt to salvage control. He stepped between Daniel and the crowd, his public mask sliding back into place. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his voice projecting the authority that had commanded boardrooms and charity dinners for 2 decades. "My brother is clearly overwrought. Family businesses can be emotional, as I'm sure you all understand. Perhaps we should. I resign." The words came out of Daniel's mouth before he'd fully formed the thought. But once spoken, they felt like the first honest thing he'd said in years. The ballroom went dead silent. "I resign from the Carter Foundation Board," Daniel repeated, louder this time. "I resign from Carter Industries. I resign from pretending that what we do here matters to anyone but ourselves." Victor's face went through several colors before settling on a dangerous shade of purple. "You can't resign. You're family." Rosa was family, Daniel shot back. "Elise is family. Marcus, a 6-year-old boy fighting for his life, is more family to me than you've ever been." The crowd erupted. Conversations exploded in every direction. Phones rang, cameras flashed, and security guards appeared at various entrances, unsure whether to intervene or simply document the spectacular collapse of one of the city's most powerful families. But Daniel only had eyes for Elise. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her son's photograph to her chest. Not tears of humiliation anymore, but something else, something that looked like hope. He walked toward her through the chaos, past board members already calculating succession plans and reporters already writing exposés and society photographers capturing every moment of the Carter family's public disintegration. When he reached Elise, he knelt again, this time not to help gather scattered papers, but to look her directly in the eye. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for all of it, for not speaking sooner, for letting him treat you the way he treated your mother, for being a coward when you needed an ally." Elise reached out with one hand, her fingers barely brushing his cheek. "Rosa always said you'd find your courage when it mattered most." Behind them, Victor was trying to regain control of the narrative, calling for calm, promising investigations into Daniel's clearly false accusations. But his voice sounded thin and desperate compared to the growing chaos. Board members were huddling in corners, legal teams were being summoned via frantic phone calls, and the society photographers who'd come to document a routine charity gala were now capturing the collapse of a dynasty. Daniel stood and faced the crowd one last time. "The Carter Foundation has $12 million in its accounts," he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "Enough to save Marcus Thompson and dozens of other children like him. But it won't happen while my brother controls the money." He turned to the board members, men and women he'd known for years, people who'd smiled at him across conference tables while voting to approve his brother's increasingly selfish policies. "You have a choice," Daniel said. "Keep protecting a system that serves no one but yourselves, or remember why the foundation was created in the first place." With that, he took Elise's arm, gently, respectfully, asking permission with his eyes before offering support, and walked with her toward the ballroom exit. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. Some faces showed support, others confusion, still others the calculating look of people already choosing sides in a battle that would reshape the city's power structure. As they reached the doors, Daniel heard Victor's voice behind them, loud and desperate. "You'll regret this, Daniel. You have nothing without me. Nothing." Daniel paused at the threshold, looking back at his brother for what he somehow knew would be the last time. "I had nothing with you," he said quietly. "That's the point." Then they were through the doors and into the hotel corridor, leaving behind the glittering ballroom and 3 decades of silence. The next 72 hours moved like a fever dream. By morning, video clips of the confrontation had gone viral across every social media platform. #JusticeForMarcus was trending on Twitter. The local news stations had picked up the story, then the national outlets, then international media fascinated by the spectacular public breakdown of American wealth and power. Daniel's phone rang constantly. Reporters, lawyers, board members, old friends, and complete strangers offering support or condemnation in equal measure. He stopped answering after the 50th call. Instead, he spent those 3 days at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, sitting beside Marcus's bed while Elise worked double shifts to pay for the medical care that was bleeding her savings dry despite insurance coverage that seemed designed to cover everything except what they actually needed. Marcus was small for 6 years old, his dark skin ashen from months of treatment. But his eyes, Rose's eyes, Elise's eyes, still held curiosity and hope despite everything his small body had endured. "Are you really rich?" Marcus asked Daniel on the second day, his voice weak but clear. "I was," Daniel said honestly. "I'm not sure what I am now." Marcus considered this with the seriousness that serious illness brings to childhood. "Mama says rich people don't usually help poor people." "Your mama's mostly right about that," Daniel admitted. "But you're helping us." "I'm trying to." Marcus smiled then, the first real smile Daniel had seen since entering the hospital. "Then maybe you're not that kind of rich person." Out of the mouths of babes. On the third morning, Daniel woke in the hospital waiting room chair where he'd been sleeping, his neck stiff and his expensive suit wrinkled beyond repair. Elise stood beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee that smelled like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. "The board wants to see you," she said quietly. Daniel accepted the coffee. It tasted exactly as bad as it smelled, and checked his watch. 9:30 a.m. Outside the hospital windows, the city was going about its normal business, unaware that inside these walls, lives were being saved or lost based on the random distribution of insurance policies and bank account balances. What did they say? "They want to meet at 10 o'clock. Emergency session." Elise's expression was unreadable. "Your brother's not invited." Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not hope. Exactly. He'd learned to be suspicious of hope. But possibility. The first hint that 38 years of cowardice might not define the rest of his life. The Carter Foundation boardroom occupied the top floor of a glass tower that scraped the belly of low-hanging clouds. Daniel had sat at this table hundreds of times, always in the chair to Victor's right, always speaking when spoken to, always voting the way Victor voted. Today, he sat at the head of the table. The 12 board members filed in like mourners at a funeral, their faces carefully neutral. These were people who'd built careers on reading political winds and choosing winning sides, and right now, the winds were howling in every direction at once. Margaret Henley, the board chair and a steel-haired woman who'd been terrifying subordinates since before Daniel was born, called the meeting to order with characteristic bluntness. "Daniel, what you did 3 nights ago was either the most courageous thing we've seen in decades or the most catastrophic. We're here to decide which." Daniel looked around the table at faces he'd known for years. Some showed genuine concern, others barely concealed calculation. All of them were waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing to a position. "Victor's threatening lawsuits," said Thomas Whitfield, the foundation's lead counsel. "Against you, against the board, against anyone who doesn't support his version of events." "What's his version?" Daniel asked. "That you've suffered some kind of mental breakdown. That your accusations are the product of stress and possibly substance abuse. That you should be removed from all foundation business pending psychiatric evaluation." Daniel almost laughed. Even in defeat, Victor was playing the same playbook he'd used their entire lives: attack the messenger, discredit the opposition, never acknowledge the possibility that he might actually be wrong about something. "And what do you think?" Margaret leaned forward, her sharp eyes boring into Daniel's. "I think Victor's scared. I think he knows that everything you said in that ballroom can be documented. And I think he's desperate to control the narrative before it completely destroys him." She slid a folder across the polished table. "We've been reviewing foundation expenditures for the past 5 years. Would you like to guess what we found?" Daniel opened the folder, though he already suspected what he'd see. Expense reports that pushed ethical boundaries. Board bonuses that consumed larger and larger percentages of donated funds. Administrative costs that had somehow grown to equal actual charitable giving. $12 million in the accounts, Margaret continued, and less than 20% actually reaches the people we're supposedly helping. The rest disappears into salaries, consulting fees, travel expenses, and operational costs that seem to exist primarily to fund Victor's lifestyle. Around the table, board members shifted uncomfortably. They'd all approved these expenditures, all signed off on the policies that prioritized institutional preservation over charitable mission. "We have a choice," Margaret said. "We can circle the wagons, protect Victor, and hope this scandal blows over. Or we can acknowledge that the foundation has lost its way and try to find it again." Daniel set down the folder. "What are you asking me?" "We're asking if you want Victor's job." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Around the table, 12 faces watched Daniel's reaction, reading tea leaves and calculating odds. Interim CEO of the Carter Foundation. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump without knowing whether there was water or rocks waiting below. "What about Marcus?" Daniel asked. Margaret smiled, the first genuine expression Daniel had seen from her in years. "First order of business. The foundation will cover all medical expenses immediately and completely. Emergency Medical Assistance Fund, retroactive approval." Something loosened in Daniel's chest. Not victory, not yet, but the first glimpse of what victory might look like. "There are conditions," Thomas the lawyer interjected. "Victor still controls 40% of the foundation's voting shares through family trust arrangements. He can't be removed entirely, only outvoted. And he's not going to go quietly." Daniel nodded. He'd expected as much. Victor had spent decades building layers of protection around his power. Removing him completely would take years of legal maneuvering and more political capital than Daniel currently possessed. Also, Margaret added, "This is interim only. 6 months to prove you can actually run the foundation differently than Victor did. If the board isn't satisfied with the results." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Daniel would be out, Victor would be back, and Marcus Thompson would become another statistic in a system designed to fail people like him. "I'll do it," Daniel said. The vote was unanimous. The call came at 3 a.m. Daniel was back in the hospital waiting room, dozing in the chair that was becoming his second home, when his phone buzzed with Margaret Henley's number. "Daniel." Her voice was crisp despite the hour. "You need to see the news." Daniel fumbled for the remote control, clicking through channels until he found the All News Network. A breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Carter Foundation Scandal. Federal Investigation Launched." The reporter, standing outside the foundation's downtown offices, spoke with the breathless excitement of someone who'd stumbled onto a career-defining story. Sources within the FBI confirmed that federal investigators have begun examining financial records for the Carter Foundation, focusing on possible violations of nonprofit regulations and misuse of charitable funds. This comes just days after a dramatic public confrontation at the foundation's annual gala, where interim CEO Daniel Carter accused his brother Victor of systematically diverting donated money away from charitable purposes. Daniel's stomach dropped. Federal investigation meant this had moved far beyond family drama or social media controversy. This was now about criminal liability, potential prison time, and the complete destruction of everything the Carter name had represented for 3 generations. "It gets worse," Margaret's voice said through the phone. "Victor's hired Preston, Matthews and Associates." Daniel recognized the law firm name immediately. They specialized in high-stakes litigation and scorched-earth tactics. If Victor had called in Preston Matthews, he was preparing for total war. "He's going to try to destroy you," Margaret continued. "Personally and professionally. Everything you said in that ballroom, every decision you make as interim CEO, every detail of your personal life. It's all going to be fair game." Through the hospital window, Daniel could see news vans beginning to gather in the parking lot. Somehow, reporters had tracked him here. Soon there would be cameras and microphones and questions shouted at families just trying to visit sick children. "I have to go," he said. "Daniel, wait. There's something else. The board is meeting tomorrow morning. Emergency session. Some members are getting cold feet about the vote yesterday. They're worried about being associated with this scandal if it gets worse." Daniel closed his eyes. Of course they were. Courage was easy when it came with social approval and minimal risk. Much harder when federal investigators started asking questions about board oversight and fiduciary responsibility. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you have about 12 hours to prove that supporting you won't destroy their reputations along with yours." The line went dead. Daniel sat in the darkness of the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the soft beeping of machines and the distant sound of nurses moving through corridors. Somewhere in this building, Marcus was sleeping, his small body fighting battles that 6-year-olds should never have to fight. Somewhere else, Elise was working a night shift at another cleaning job, trying to earn money that would never be enough to cover the medical bills that kept growing faster than any paycheck. And somewhere across town, Victor was plotting Daniel's destruction with the same methodical precision he'd once used to break Daniel's toys and blame him for the damage. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Meet me in the parking garage. Level B2. Come alone. Elise." He found her in the shadows between concrete pillars, still wearing her cleaning uniform from whatever building she'd been working in tonight. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes held the same determined fire that had carried her into that ballroom 3 nights ago. "You shouldn't be here," she said without preamble. "The reporters, the investigation, staying close to me is only going to make things worse for you." Daniel almost laughed. "Elise, I'm about to lose everything I've ever had. My job, my reputation, probably my freedom if those federal investigators find what I think they're going to find. You think I care about making things worse?" She studied his face in the harsh fluorescent light. "Do you regret it?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Daniel thought about everything he'd lost in 72 hours. His position, his security, his relationship with the only family he'd ever known. Then he thought about Marcus upstairs, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months because his medical bills were finally paid. "Ask me again in 6 months," he said, "when I'm either rebuilding this foundation or sitting in federal prison." Elise stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "My mother used to say that some people are born to follow, and some are born to lead. But the rarest ones are born to choose. Which one am I?" "You chose, Daniel. Finally, after 38 years, you chose." Her hand found his in the darkness, fingers interlacing with a familiarity that transcended the decades between childhood friendship bracelets and adult consequences. "Whatever happens next," she said, "Marcus will grow up knowing that someone fought for him, that someone saw him as worth fighting for." Daniel squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her certainty. Tomorrow would bring new battles, board meetings and federal investigators, and Victor's scorched earth legal strategy. But tonight, in a hospital parking garage, he'd found something he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. Purpose. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 a.m. sharp, before the reporters could fully mobilize, but late enough for the overnight polling data to be complete. Margaret had hired a crisis management firm that worked through the night, conducting focus groups and measuring public opinion about the Carter Foundation scandal. The results were mixed. 43% viewed Daniel sympathetically, reported the crisis manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Chun who specialized in reputation rehabilitation. They see him as a whistleblower standing up to corporate corruption. 31% view him negatively, either as a disgruntled family member airing personal grievances or as someone potentially complicit in the financial irregularities he's now exposing. Daniel sat at the head of the conference table again, but today the chair felt less like a throne and more like an electric chair. Around the table, board members avoided eye contact, their expressions ranging from concerned to openly hostile. "The remaining 26% are undecided," Sarah continued, "but their opinions will likely be shaped by how this investigation unfolds and what concrete actions the foundation takes in response." Thomas Whitfield, the foundation's lawyer, looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days. "The federal investigators want to interview every board member individually. They're looking at tax filings going back 7 years, expense reports, vendor relationships, everything." "What are they likely to find?" asked Margaret, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Thomas consulted his notes, though Daniel suspected he could recite the problems from memory. Potential violations of the intermediate sanctions rule, excessive compensation for Victor and other key employees, possible private inurement through foundation-funded travel and entertainment expenses, questions about whether charitable purposes have been adequately served given the percentage of funds going to administrative costs. Each legal term hit like a physical blow. Daniel had signed off on many of these expenses over the years, rubber-stamping decisions without asking the hard questions that might have prevented this crisis. Worst case scenario? Margaret pressed. Loss of tax-exempt status for the foundation. Personal liability for board members who approved questionable expenditures. Potential criminal charges if investigators determine there was deliberate fraud rather than just negligent oversight. The room fell silent. These were people accustomed to wielding power without consequence, to making decisions that affected other people's lives while insulating themselves from personal risk. The possibility of actual criminal liability was sobering in a way that social embarrassment or financial loss could never be. Board member Patricia Vance, a silver-haired woman who'd inherited her seat from her late husband, spoke first. Perhaps we moved too hastily yesterday. Given these new developments, it might be prudent to reconsider Daniel's appointment until the legal situation clarifies. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Daniel watched faces that had been supportive 24 hours ago, now calculating the personal cost of continued association with his leadership. "You want to reinstate Victor?" Daniel asked quietly. "We want to protect the foundation," Patricia replied. "And by extension, protect the charitable work we're meant to be doing." It was a reasonable position, politically defensible and strategically sound. It was also exactly the kind of thinking that had allowed the foundation to drift so far from its original mission that a federal investigation was now necessary to force course correction. Daniel stood, his decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I resign." The words came easier this time, without the tremor of uncertainty that had marked his ballroom declaration. This wasn't desperation or emotional breakdown. It was choice, deliberate and clear-eyed. "You can reinstate Victor, or find someone else, or dissolve the foundation entirely," Daniel continued. "But I won't be part of a system that prioritizes institutional preservation over the people we're supposed to serve." Margaret's face remained impassive, but Daniel caught a flicker of something. Approval? Respect? In her eyes. "Before you make any irreversible decisions, there's something you should know." She gestured to Sarah Chun, the crisis manager, who pulled out a tablet and swiped through several screens of data. "The Marcus Thompson story has resonated beyond anything we projected," Sarah said. "Donations to his medical fund have reached $200,000 in 72 hours. More importantly, other families have started coming forward with similar stories: medical crises, educational needs, emergency housing situations. All of them saying they applied to the Carter Foundation for help and were rejected despite meeting published criteria." She showed Daniel the tablet screen, which displayed a social media feed that had become an impromptu clearinghouse for people sharing their experiences with the foundation. "This isn't just about one family anymore," Sarah continued. "It's become a symbol of systemic failure in charitable organizations. The public isn't just watching to see if Marcus gets his surgery. They're watching to see if institutional change is actually possible." Around the table, board members were recalculating. Public sympathy for Marcus was one thing. A broader narrative about charitable accountability was something else entirely. The kind of story that could influence legislation, trigger regulatory changes, and create long-term consequences for everyone involved in foundation management. "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked, though his lawyer's instincts had clearly already identified the implications. "I'm suggesting that the board has two choices," Sarah replied. "You can distance yourselves from Daniel and hope the scandal dies down, which might work in the short term, but leaves you vulnerable to ongoing criticism about returning to the status quo. Or you can double down on reform. Use this crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate genuine institutional change and potentially emerge as a model for foundation accountability." It was a gamble, the kind of high-stakes bet that could either rehabilitate the Carter Foundation's reputation or destroy it completely. Daniel looked around the table at faces he'd known for years. People who'd smiled politely at charity dinners while voting to approve policies that served themselves more than the community they claimed to represent. "I'm not withdrawing my resignation," he said, "but I'll make you a counterproposal. Give me 60 days as interim CEO with complete operational authority. No board oversight, no Victor interference, no committee approvals for individual grants. Let me prove that this foundation can actually function as a charitable organization rather than a tax shelter." The silence stretched long enough that Daniel could hear the air conditioning cycling on, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the muffled conversations of office workers beginning another day of mundane corporate routine. Margaret was the first to speak. What happens after 60 days? Full board review. If the foundation is serving more families, if our administrative costs are reasonable, if the federal investigation finds we're operating within legal guidelines, then you consider making the appointment permanent. If not, you find new leadership and I disappear quietly. And if the federal investigation finds criminal liability, Daniel met her gaze directly. Then I take full responsibility for everything that happened on my watch. And the board moves forward without the Carter name attached to any of it. It was a deal that offered board members everything they wanted: distance from personal liability, opportunity for institutional rehabilitation, and a clear exit strategy if things went badly. The kind of arrangement that let people feel good about taking reasonable risks with minimal personal exposure. The vote was 8-4 in favor. Victor's response came 6 hours later, delivered by courier to Daniel's temporary office in the foundation building. The legal document was 12 pages long, but the essential message was simple: total war. Victor was challenging Daniel's appointment in court, demanding forensic audits of every decision made since the board vote, and filing personal lawsuits against board members who'd supported the leadership change. He was also releasing a statement to the press characterizing Daniel as mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to foundation operations. Daniel read the legal papers twice, then set them aside and picked up the phone. His first call was to Marcus Thompson's medical team, authorizing payment for the experimental treatment protocol that offered the best chance of complete remission. His second call was to the foundation's grant review committee, scheduling emergency meetings to process the backlog of applications that had been pending for months, while Victor focused on more prestigious donations from wealthy donors. By close of business, the foundation had approved emergency grants totaling $400,000, more direct aid to families in crisis than had been distributed in the previous 6 months combined. It felt like revolution. Small-scale, bureaucratic, involving nothing more dramatic than signatures on grant approval forms. But revolution nonetheless. The reporters were waiting when Daniel left the building that evening. Cameras flashed as he walked toward his car, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Mr. Carter, how do you respond to your brother's accusations that you're mentally unfit for leadership? Mr. Carter, is it true that the foundation is nearly bankrupt due to financial mismanagement? Mr. Carter, what's your relationship with the Thompson family? Are you personally involved with Elise Thompson?" Daniel paused at his car door, keys in hand. The smart move was to say nothing. Let the lawyers handle media relations, avoid creating additional sound bites that could be taken out of context and used against him. Instead, he turned to face the cameras. Today, the Carter Foundation approved grants to help 12 families facing medical emergencies, he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Tomorrow, we'll approve more. That's what we're supposed to do: help people when they need help most. What about the federal investigation? A reporter shouted. I welcome it, Daniel replied. If this foundation has been operating improperly, that needs to be corrected. If board members or staff have violated their fiduciary duties, they need to be held accountable, including me. He got in his car and drove away, leaving the reporters to craft their stories from 30 seconds of sound bites and years of accumulated scandal. The first death threat arrived on day 4 of Daniel's interim leadership. It was hand-delivered to the foundation offices, addressed in block letters with no return address. The message inside was brief and to the point: stop destroying the Carter legacy or we'll stop you permanently. Margaret called an emergency security meeting. Within hours, Daniel had a bodyguard, a quiet, efficient woman named Janet who'd worked corporate security for 20 years and had the kind of presence that discouraged trouble without announcing itself. Mostly, it's symbolic, Janet explained as she walked Daniel through basic security protocols. People who make specific threats rarely follow through. But people who feel their worldview is under attack sometimes do unpredictable things. The second threat came via email, more detailed and more disturbing. It included Daniel's home address, his car license number, and a photograph of him leaving the hospital after visiting Marcus. The message suggested that traitors to their own class deserved whatever happened to them. By the end of the first week, there were 5 more threats, ranging from crude insults to elaborate descriptions of violence. The FBI added them to their investigation file, but Janet was blunt about the practical implications. You've made yourself a symbol, she said. Some people love what you represent, others hate it. Both reactions make you a target in different ways. Daniel's second week as interim CEO brought different challenges. The foundation's phone system was overwhelmed with calls from families requesting help, reporters seeking comments, and donors either pledging support or withdrawing it entirely. The small staff was working 16-hour days trying to process grant applications with a system designed to discourage rather than facilitate aid. On Tuesday, Daniel authorized the hiring of 6 additional caseworkers specifically to handle medical emergency grants. On Wednesday, he eliminated the requirement for 3-month waiting periods between application and review. On Thursday, he established an emergency hotline that could approve grants of up to $10,000 within 24 hours for families facing immediate crisis. Each change generated new controversy. Donors who preferred the old system complained about fiscal irresponsibility. Board members worried about inadequate oversight. Victor's lawyers filed motions arguing that Daniel was exceeding his authority and potentially violating fiduciary duties. But the grants were working. Marcus Thompson's condition stabilized, then began improving. His oncologist reported that the experimental treatment protocol was showing promising results, with significant reduction in cancer markers and improved immune system function. More importantly, other children were getting help too. Sarah Martinez, whose daughter needed emergency surgery after a car accident. David Kim, whose son required specialized equipment for a rare genetic disorder. Jennifer Washington, whose twin boys both needed hearing aids that insurance wouldn't cover. Each successful grant generated local news coverage, social media posts from grateful families, and additional donations from people who wanted to support what they saw as a return to genuine charitable work. By the end of the second week, the foundation had processed more individual grants than in any month of Victor's leadership. Administrative costs had dropped to 15% of total expenditures, still higher than ideal, but approaching reasonable levels for the first time in years. Daniel was working 18-hour days, sleeping on the office couch more often than in his own bed, surviving on coffee and whatever sandwiches Janet brought from the deli downstairs. But for the first time since childhood, he felt like his life had a purpose beyond simply surviving Victor's proximity. The call from Margaret came at 11 p.m. on Friday of the second week. "Victor's escalating," she said without preamble. "He's scheduled a press conference for Monday morning. His lawyers are claiming that your grant approvals violate nonprofit regulations and that you're using foundation resources for personal benefit." Daniel rubbed his eyes, trying to focus through exhaustion that felt bone deep. Personal benefit? The Marcus Thompson grants. Victor's arguing that you have an improper personal relationship with the family, that the grants constitute gifts to people you're romantically involved with, and that the board should invalidate everything you've approved pending investigation. It was smart, Daniel had to admit. Victor was reframing the narrative from institutional corruption to personal impropriety, from systemic failure to individual misconduct. If he could make the story about Daniel's relationship with Elise rather than the foundation's responsibility to serve families in crisis, he might be able to reclaim moral authority. Is there any truth to it? Margaret asked. Daniel thought about the question seriously. His relationship with Elise had certainly evolved beyond childhood friendship and professional courtesy. They'd spent hours together at the hospital, talking about everything from Marcus's treatment to their shared memories of Rosa to their fears about the future. There was connection, undeniably. Attraction, certainly. But romance? No, he said finally. There's no romantic relationship. There's history, and there's friendship, and there's mutual respect. But nothing that would constitute conflict of interest. Good, Margaret replied. Because Victor's going to make that the centerpiece of his counterattack. He's going to argue that everything you've done as interim CEO has been motivated by personal interest rather than charitable purpose. Daniel stared out the office window at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, Marcus was sleeping peacefully in his own bed for the first time in months. Somewhere else, Sarah Martinez's daughter was recovering from surgery that might have been delayed or denied under the old grant system. Dozens of families were building better futures because the foundation had finally started functioning as intended. Let him, Daniel said. Margaret paused. Daniel, you understand what this means? If Victor successfully characterizes your decisions as personally motivated, the board will have no choice but to remove you, not just from interim leadership, but potentially from any future involvement with the foundation. I understand, and you're willing to risk that. Daniel thought about Rosa, about the woman who'd raised him with more love and attention than his own parents had ever shown. About her daughter, who'd had the courage to walk into that ballroom and demand justice. About her grandson, who'd shown him what real bravery looked like by facing cancer with 6-year-old resilience. Some things are worth risking everything for, he said. Victor's press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. Monday morning in the Foundation's main conference room. Daniel arrived early, wanting to be present when his brother delivered what would almost certainly be the final blow to his leadership. The room was packed with reporters, photographers, Foundation staff, and several board members who'd clearly chosen sides in the battle for institutional control. Victor stood at the podium in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his silver hair impeccably styled, every inch the successful CEO who'd built a charitable empire. Daniel took a seat in the back corner, Janet positioning herself nearby with the subtle alertness of someone prepared for trouble. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded rooms like this for 2 decades. "I'm here today to address serious concerns about the Carter Foundation's recent operations under my brother's interim leadership." He gestured toward a presentation screen that displayed financial data, grant records, and organizational charts. Every slide was professionally designed, every number precisely calculated to support his narrative. "In the past 2 weeks, Daniel Carter has approved grants totaling $1.3 million, Victor continued. "This represents more direct spending than the Foundation typically authorizes in 6 months, with minimal oversight and inadequate documentation of need." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras rolled, and Daniel felt the familiar weight of Victor's ability to twist truth into something that served his purposes. "More troubling," Victor said, "is evidence that these decisions have been influenced by personal relationships rather than objective charitable criteria." The screen displayed a photograph. Daniel and Elise in the hospital parking garage, their hands clasped together in the moment of connection that had sustained Daniel through 2 weeks of crisis. "My brother has been romantically involved with Miss Thompson for several weeks," Victor announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone revealing a devastating secret. "The grants to her family, totaling nearly $50,000, represent a clear conflict of interest and potential misuse of charitable funds for personal benefit." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and several board members exchanged glances that suggested Victor's accusations might be effective. Daniel stood slowly, aware that every eye in the room was now focused on him. Janet tensed beside him, ready to intervene if the crowd's energy turned dangerous. "That's not true," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the room despite its quiet tone. Victor smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Are you denying that you have a personal relationship with Miss Thompson?" "I'm denying that it's romantic. I'm denying that it influenced my decisions. And I'm denying that grants to her family represent anything other than what they are: emergency medical assistance to a child with cancer." Daniel walked toward the front of the room, the crowd parting before him. When he reached the podium, Victor stepped aside with obvious reluctance. "My brother is correct about one thing," Daniel said, addressing the cameras directly. "I do have a personal relationship with Elise Thompson. We've known each other since childhood. Her mother worked in our house for 20 years, raising us when our own parents were too busy to be bothered." He gestured toward the presentation screen, which still displayed the photograph of him and Elise in the parking garage. "That photograph was taken after I'd spent 3 days sleeping in hospital waiting rooms, watching a 6-year-old boy fight for his life, while his mother worked double shifts to pay medical bills that would bankrupt most families." Daniel's voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm, the words coming from a place deeper than strategy or calculation. "Victor wants you to believe that my decisions have been motivated by romance or personal benefit. But let me tell you what actually motivated them: shame. Shame that an organization with $12 million in assets was turning away families in crisis because helping them might interfere with board bonuses and administrative salaries." He pulled out his phone, swiping to a notes app where he'd been tracking the Foundation's activities. "In 2 weeks, we've helped 43 families facing medical emergencies. We've prevented 3 foreclosures. We've provided educational scholarships to 17 children whose parents couldn't afford school supplies." Each number hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't abstract policy discussion. It was concrete evidence of lives improved, futures saved, hope restored. The total cost was $1.3 million, as my brother said. That's less than the foundation spent on administrative expenses in the previous 6 months under his leadership. Daniel turned to look directly at Victor, seeing his older brother clearly for perhaps the first time in their adult lives. You want to know about conflict of interest? Let's talk about the $100,000 consulting contract you approved for your golf buddy's marketing firm. Let's discuss the $50,000 travel budget for donor development that funded your vacation in Europe. Let's examine the board bonuses that somehow increased every year while charitable giving stagnated. Victor's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed narrative collapsing under the weight of documented facts. You're right about one thing, Daniel continued, his voice carrying absolute conviction. This is personal. It's personal because Rosa Thompson spent 20 years cleaning up messes that you and I made, literally and figuratively. It's personal because her daughter had the courage to walk into a room full of people who looked down on her and demand justice. It's personal because her grandson taught me what bravery actually looks like. The room had gone completely silent now, cameras rolling as Daniel delivered what everyone recognized as either vindication or political suicide. So yes, Victor, my decisions have been influenced by personal relationships. By my relationship with a woman who showed me what integrity means. By my relationship with a child who's fighting battles that no 6-year-old should face. By my relationship with a community that deserves better than what this foundation has given them. Daniel turned back to the cameras, speaking directly to the lens as if addressing each viewer individually. If that's a conflict of interest, then I'm guilty as charged. If caring about the people we're supposed to serve disqualifies me from leadership, then I accept that disqualification. But I won't apologize for finally doing the job that this foundation was created to do. He stepped away from the podium and walked toward the exit, leaving Victor to face a room full of reporters whose questions were no longer about Daniel's fitness for leadership, but about the specific financial irregularities he'd just outlined. As Daniel reached the door, he heard Margaret's voice from the crowd. The board will convene an emergency session this afternoon to address these new developments. Daniel nodded without turning around and walked out of the room, out of the building, and into an uncertain future that felt more like freedom than anything he'd experienced in 38 years. The board's decision was unanimous. Victor Carter was removed as CEO of the Carter Foundation, effective immediately. The board voted to accept his resignation from all leadership positions and to cooperate fully with federal investigators examining foundation operations under his tenure. Daniel Carter was offered the permanent position of CEO, with full operational authority and a mandate to restructure the organization according to best practices for charitable foundations. The offer came with conditions: annual salary of $100,000, compared to Victor's $400,000, elimination of board bonuses, and commitment to maintaining administrative costs below 20% of total expenditures. Daniel accepted without negotiation. The press coverage that followed painted the story in broad strokes. Good brother defeats evil brother, corruption exposed, justice served. But the reality was more complex, as reality always is. Victor disappeared from public life, his lawyers negotiating settlements that kept him out of prison but cost him most of his personal fortune. The federal investigation concluded with fines and regulatory oversight, but no criminal charges, finding negligent mismanagement rather than deliberate fraud. Several board members resigned, unable to stomach the foundation's new focus on actual charitable work rather than social networking and tax benefits. Others stayed and discovered that helping families in crisis was more satisfying than they'd expected. Daniel moved out of his downtown apartment and into a smaller place closer to the foundation offices. He sold his luxury car and bought something practical. He learned to cook simple meals and discovered that he preferred grocery store coffee to the expensive blends that had once defined his mornings. The changes felt like shedding skin that had never quite fit. 3 months into his permanent tenure as CEO, the foundation had helped over 200 families. Marcus Thompson was in complete remission, his prognosis excellent. The foundation's reputation had been rebuilt through consistent action rather than public relations campaigns. And Daniel had learned that the person he'd been afraid of becoming for 38 years was actually the person he'd been all along, just waiting for permission to exist. The permission hadn't come from Victor or the board or society's approval. It had come from a 6-year-old boy who'd shown him what courage looked like, from a woman who demanded justice in a room full of people who'd rather not hear it, and from the memory of someone who'd loved him enough to see his potential when he couldn't see it himself. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sound of children playing in the corridor outside. Marcus sat up in bed, looking healthier than he had in months, his dark eyes bright with the resilience that had carried him through the worst of his treatment. Daniel sat beside the bed, holding Marcus's small hand while Elise dozed in the chair nearby. She'd been working fewer hours lately, the foundation having offered her a position as community outreach coordinator, a job that used her natural ability to connect with families in crisis. "Are you going to marry my mama?" Marcus asked, his 6-year-old directness cutting through any adult pretense. Daniel glanced at Elise, who was definitely not sleeping despite her closed eyes. They'd been exploring the possibility of something beyond friendship, carefully and without rush, building trust through shared purpose and mutual respect. "That's a conversation for grown-ups to have," Daniel said diplomatically. Marcus considered this with the seriousness that serious illness had taught him. "Mama says you saved my life." "Your mama saved your life," Daniel replied. "And the doctors. And you, by being braver than most adults I know. But you helped." "I helped," Daniel agreed. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his thin face into something that belonged on a much healthier child. "Good," he said. "I like you." It was perhaps the most important performance review Daniel had ever received. Elise opened her eyes, her smile warm with affection and amusement. "Subtle as always," she told her son. "I learned from the best," Marcus replied, making both adults laugh. Outside the hospital window, the city continued its daily business. People hurrying to appointments, children playing in parks, families navigating the challenges and joys of ordinary life. The Carter Foundation offices hummed with activity as caseworkers processed applications, approved grants, and connected families with resources they needed to build better futures. It wasn't the life Daniel had planned. It was better, because sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones where you defeat your enemies. They're the ones where you finally stop being afraid of who you really are. And sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the simple decision to help when help is needed, to speak when silence is safer, and to choose love over fear even when the cost seems too high to bear. Daniel squeezed Marcus's hand and smiled at Elise, feeling Rosa's presence in the room like a benediction. She'd been right all along. He did have light in him. It had just taken him 38 years to find the courage to let it shine. 6 months later, the Carter Foundation was recognized by the National Association of Charitable Organizations for excellence in community service and fiscal responsibility. Daniel Carter's acceptance speech lasted exactly 90 seconds and contained no mention of his brother, the family scandal, or the journey that had brought him to that moment. Instead, he talked about Marcus Thompson's recovery, about the importance of community support for families in crisis, and about the privilege of serving people who had the courage to ask for help when they needed it most. In the audience, Elise Thompson smiled and applauded, her engagement ring catching the light as she clapped. Beside her, Marcus, now 7 years old and cancer-free, wore a small tuxedo and the serious expression of someone who understood that sometimes grown-ups needed children to show them how to be brave. The evening ended with Daniel kneeling beside Marcus's chair, both of them laughing at some private joke that made Elise shake her head in mock despair at the two most important men in her life. Rosa would have been proud. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.